Now, I don't know what comes to mind for you when you think of death or dying. Some of us might think of someone that we've lost who's died and we miss them. Others might think about our own death. I know people speculate about how they would or wouldn't like to die. But the fact is that most of us don't really like to think about death at all in the first place. And yet, in this series that we're doing about death and grieving, it makes sense that if we're really going to understand and overcome grief, that we really ought to have a good understanding of death and dying, what that's all about. And the first thing that we see is that death is an unavoidable part of living in this world. Now let's start by taking a look at Psalm 90. Psalm 90 gives us a great biblical perspective on living and dying. Let's start by reading verse 2. Before the mountains were born, before you gave birth to the earth and the world, from beginning to end, you are God. Now, verse 2 really frames the whole conversation by giving us a glimpse of eternity. It talks about God, how God is eternal. God never dies. God continues to live. But by contrast to that, human beings are so fleeting and our lives come and go so quickly, as we see in verse 5. You sweep people away like dreams that disappear. They're like grass that springs up in the morning. In the morning it blooms and flourishes, but by evening it is dry and withered. Now verse 10, 70 years are given to us, some even live to 80. But even the best years are filled with pain and trouble. Soon they disappear and we fly away. The point he's making in this psalm is that there's simply no way that we can avoid the fragility of life. Some people live a little bit longer, some people less so. Some people live easier lives than others, but there's no way to avoid the reality of death. Now, that wasn't God's original creation. God made the world and made human beings so that there was no death. And death came in as a result of sin. That wasn't God's best. But now that we live in this fallen world, death is inevitable. Death is going to happen to all of us. Second, we're wise to face death and to live life accordingly. Psalm 90 verse 12 says, "Teach us to realize the brevity of life so that we may grow in wisdom." So first he says here to realize how brief life is. None of us is going to live forever. Our time on this earth is fleeting. We need to understand that it's just flying by. And as I've gotten older, it seems like life flies by even faster than it ever did. And then the second thing he says, then grow in wisdom. See, if we understand the nature of this life and how short it is, then that's an opportunity for us to learn to live in wisdom. In other words, to live in light of the perspective of the brevity of life. And so he says, you know what? How are you going to live if you know that life is short and you don't have much time? Then he says you're going to live wisely. Now, what that does not mean is just to do whatever you want to do. Because life is short, then YOLO. You only live once, so go ahead and get involved in everything and do whatever and just live for your wanton desires and live without regard to anything in the future. That's not what he's saying, because life is short, but the other factor is that we live life in the perspective of God. And that's what he says in verse 8. You spread out our sins before you, our secret sins, and you see them all. So this says that wisdom means to live life with an understanding of our accountability to God, that we're going to give an account to God for whatever we did with the few short years that he gave us in this life. That's what it means to live with reference to God. And then the rest of the psalm goes on to talk about how we live in dependence on God. To live wisely means to live trusting God for our lives. And we see that in verse 14. Satisfy us each morning with your unfailing love, so we may sing for joy to the end of our lives. Now, we may not have a lot of mornings, but as many as we have, we can live them in the satisfaction of God's unfailing love for us. And that's what gives us joy. Now look at verse 17. And may the Lord our God show us his approval and make our efforts successful. Yes, make our efforts successful. So a life of trusting God is not idle. We do make efforts, we do make plans, we have goals, and we want those things to succeed. But wisdom means that in pursuing those goals and those efforts, we do so in dependence on God. We trust God to make the efforts of our brief lives to be a success. And I'm sure you can think of other ways that when you really reckon with the reality and the inevitability of death, that it's going to change how we live and what we do with the life that we have while we're here. Now, even though we want to be honest about facing up to death and its reality, we don't want to be intimidated by death or to be afraid of it. So let's look at another passage to see one final point. For those who belong to Jesus, death is not to be feared. Hebrews chapter 2 says, because God's children are human beings made of flesh and blood, the Son also became flesh and blood. For only as a human being could he die, and only by dying could he break the power of the devil, who had the power of death. Only in this way could he set free all who have lived their lives as slaves to the fear of dying. So for Christians, death no longer has the power that it once had. It no longer has the power to separate us from God. Yes, death is sorrowful because it causes us to lose someone that we love. And yes, death can still be painful and difficult to endure. But now we understand that death is really only a portal that ushers us into the presence of God. Now look down at verse 17. As our high priest before God, then he could offer a sacrifice that would take away the sins of the people. So death is not to be feared because Jesus took away the sins of his people, and his sacrifice secured the forgiveness of our sins. And this forgiveness is available to everyone who simply places their trust in Jesus and him alone. So if you have a healthy, honest understanding of death, then you can have a healthy approach to grief. Yes, we still grieve. We've lost someone, but we don't grieve without hope because now we see the bigger picture. Now, in the next session, we're going to look at how God cares for people who are going through the loss of someone that they love.